which seems seeding wise, as we were looking forward to a bracket, a little harsh. Good afternoon on bracket release day. This is the D3 Datacast. I'm Zach Steiner, joined by Matt Snyder. Ready, Matt? We now have our official 2024 Division III men's basketball bracket. React.
It's just fun to know the teams. It's fun when the team you follow does get in, even though we kind of felt like our team was going to get in. But now we know where teams are headed, what the matchups are going to be like. I think we have some really, really interesting first round matchups. I think we have some first round matchups or potential second, third round matchups that we thought might be Final Four type matchups. But good time of year. We'll have to dive through the bracket and give our initial thoughts here today.
All right, let's set the stage here, Matt, for this week, because it's going to be a big week here. We're pushing this out as soon as we can, right after we just watched the bracket reveal. We're going to give some quick thoughts. We're pushing this out, and then we're going to do our deep dive looking at the first round in particular, but those opening weekend pods. That will be, our main topic in our normal weekly episode, which will be available on Patreon in early access sometime later here Monday, and we'll go out just for our general release in our normal 45 a.m. Eastern Time morning time slot. Matt, immediately after that, we will follow up with taking a zoomed out view and look at overall championship odds for every team in the bracket. Round by round, what are the odds based on the D3 Datacast computer of moving on through each round? That was a really fun look at we did last year. Yeah. We're going to bring that back for an episode that will drop on Wednesday. Again, that will be available by Tuesday sometime in early access on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show, join us on Patreon, perhaps gain early access to those future episodes, head to patreon.com/D3Datacast. But Matt, we're trying to push this out, so let's get on to a quick bracket review here. Let's start with the top line. We, with the way that the bracket is laid out, we can deduce who the committee saw as the top overall seeds, right? So we don't have like East region, West region, but we can talk about the Hampton-Sydney quadrant, right? Hampton-Sydney looks like they were considered the top overall seed, and then the way the bracket is shaped, it seems that they were joined by Widener, Case Western Reserve, and Randolph-Macon as the top 4 overall seeds in this tournament.
Yeah, and just a comment here on our little bracket graphic you can see on the screen, we included sort of Division I style seeding numbers, which we know is not really a thing they do in Division III, strictly speaking, as much as Division I does. But they do try to do some manner of seeding and follow seeding to a large degree. Like you can see the 1 versus 16 matchups all, I think, make sense that way. The hosts are all your top 4 seeds. I'm going to comment a little bit on seeding, but we know that there's other things in Division III that take precedence sometimes. 500-mile geography to avoid flights. NCAA will pay to bus teams within 500 miles. That's a big deal. So just how your geography shapes the bracket is a big thing. Moving around teams to balance the bracket by regions is something the committees does. We'll talk about that as well. But Zach, I think we saw those top 4 overall seeds, and I think from what we've been looking at data-wise, those made sense. I think those were the top 4 overall seeds that kind of you and I had been predicting in this last week or so leading up to the championship. It looked like they had been kind of solidified. I'd maybe thought if there's one team that could sneak in, maybe NYU could do that. But seeing them kind of more on a 2 line does not surprise me.
Yeah, we felt Hampton-Sydney and Randolph-Macon were locked in heading into the conference tournament time. Matt had the chance to join Dave McHugh on Hoopsville, kind of breaking down some of this stuff. And on that appearance, I thought probably Case Western with a win over Carnegie Mellon in that final UAA weekend. That was like a win, and maybe they were able to clinch. Of course, they did get that win, and we see them here as one of the other 1 seeds. And probably Widener was locked in, right? We saw them take a loss in the MAC Commonwealth Championship game, and they're here as our kind of de facto 1 seed as well.
Yeah, and Randolph-Macon losing in the ODAC, semifinals?
Yes.
And they had already locked in that position as well. So I think those all make sense. Want to talk about some of the other hosts really quick?
Yeah. Let's do it.
So just jumping down to the bottom of the bracket, opposite the 1 seeds, are some of the 2 seeds. I think a lot of these make sense. Trinity, Texas, I think was kind of in that position for much of the stretch, even though we saw them take a loss in the SCAC tournament. I think them being a 2 seed makes sense to me. NYU, like I said, I think they were definitely right up there. And WashU, I think for sure that makes sense. A team I'm surprised to see being treated in this bracket more like a 2 seed is Guilford. I think that they had lost to Virginia Wesleyan earlier in the ODAC tournament. They're definitely a good team. They're definitely a host for me. I kind of had them more as a fringe 3 or maybe a 4 seed. So I don't know. I guess I'm surprised to see them here a little bit. It's maybe quibbling a little bit. I would have put them on a different spot on the bracket. I think that's a really strong seeding for Guilford. I don't know if they did that as a way to attempt to separate the ODAC teams a little bit more
split
into
up the
4
ODAC,
quadrants. Yeah. And on one hand, I get that, but on the other hand, like, I don't know if that was the reason why Guilford slid all the way up to a 2 seed. I would be surprised at that. I expected to see more like a Trinity, Connecticut kind of be in that position. Maybe you could have worked that out. But then they would have been in a pod with either Hampton-Sydney, or not a pod, but a quadrant with either Hampton-Sydney or Randolph-Macon. I don't know that you need to, in my mind, you need to protect the ODACs to get all the way to the Final Four. Like an Elite Eight matchup is totally fine for those conferences, even though they were good. But Guilford has a strong resume, but they didn't build on it at the end. And they were a team that I was just surprised to see kind of being treated this high a little bit.
Yeah, it seems like it's interesting if they're going out of their way to try to divide up the ODACs. It's interesting that they're taking that approach when you see the way things have to work out with Region 10, where a lot of times if 2 teams within the same conference meet, or if they both win, they have to face each other in the second round. And I get there are certain restrictions around that, but then why go out of your way to split up the ODACs and mess with the seeding as a result?
Yeah, and I think one of the themes I can pull out from this entire bracket is they did try to mix up conferences and did try to mix up regions as much as possible. And we'll talk about the Texas pod, I think, in a little bit further. So I guess splitting up teams into different quadrants makes sense. Like, for instance, we see Calvin and Hope in different quadrants. To me, that is just a result of the way geography had to happen. I don't think they were intentionally trying to separate those two MIAA teams, because we see, you're Trine in the same quadrant as Hope. Obviously, those teams weren't seeded as high as the ODAC, so trying to separate them, I think, makes some sense. I just feel like that's maybe a little bit too, soft is the wrong word, but I think a little bit too favorable for Guilford, in my opinion. But then in that same vein, talking about some of the other hosts, looking up to the 3 line, Cal Lutheran, I think makes sense to me as a host. Kind of surprised to see them right next to the other Region 10 pods. Like we can put Region 10 pods anywhere because they're going to have to fly the second weekend regardless. So just kind of surprised that that's not moved somewhere else geographically to help the regions somewhere. There's definitely things that could have been done, particularly if Guilford was not on that 2 line. I think we could have used a lot of space. Maybe move Trinity down, maybe move Cal Lutheran all the way over to the Randolph-Macon pod, yada, yada. I think there's things we could have done. Just surprised to see that, if St. Thomas and Trinity, they moved St. Thomas, Texas out of that Texas pod, I think, to avoid that 4th meeting between those 2 teams that we've seen this year. But then that could just be a Sweet 16 meeting. So, if you're going to go to the trouble of moving teams to avoid the matchup, in this case, I'm surprised that they didn't maybe move that pod a little bit more.
Now, in the past, Matt, when we have very imbalanced brackets, we could talk about like a bracket of death or a pod of death. I think we're past those days. But you talk about maybe Guilford being a little bit overseeded and where their pod is arranged. We see John Carroll Guilford being overseeded, John Carroll maybe being underseeded, and that for a second consecutive year, setting up what could potentially be just a bonkers Sweet 16 matchup for Randolph-Macon, right? This was one of our immediate reactions last year. Randolph-Macon similarly was a number 1 seed, like in their quadrant. But in that same pod, right where John Carroll is this year, was Oswego State. We got that Sweet 16 matchup there at Crenshaw, and Randolph-Macon bowed out. But just in terms of team quality and what we felt like seeding would be going into that tournament, it just felt like that should have happened at least a round later. And here we go with Randolph-Macon once again in that same position, having to draw John Carroll in a potential Sweet 16 matchup.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about a bracket of death, to me, initial first blush reactions is it's that Randolph-Macon quadrant for those reasons that you said. If you pull all the hosts forward one weekend, then we're getting a Sweet 16 matchup of Randolph-Macon against John Carroll and then Trinity, Connecticut versus NYU. That seems crazy to me. And to be clear, in this conversation for this episode today, I'm more focusing on how I think the NCAA should be seeding the bracket based on the primary criteria, not necessarily overall team strength like a Massey ratings or a top 25 poll or an efficiency ratings. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but now, and this is what I was talking about with Guilford as well as like a 2-seed overseeded, is I think that their NCAA criteria, winning percentage, strength of schedule, etc., had fallen off a little bit for me. Still top 16, but maybe more like 12, not like 8. And I think that's the case here with John Carroll. Now, I think the argument against them is they lost a bunch of regionally ranked opponents towards the end, or they didn't end up with as many as we thought in OAC play. So maybe they don't look super strong in that category. I still don't really see them on a 4 line here. I think that's surprising. I thought for them, I'd see them in like a 2 or a 3. And again, if we could do something else with Guilford, make them a 3 or a 4, then I think we could have moved things around here and made this a little bit more balanced. But I definitely think from a seeding perspective, John Carroll right next to the Randolph-Macon pod, and then some of those other teams we see in that pod, with John Carroll, I think that's a very strong pod in a very strong region.
And heading into the final week, Matt, we talked about the expectation that Hampton-Sydney and Randolph-Macon would be top 4 overall seeds. Widener and Case Western Reserve, we saw probably having an inside track. Now, if we expanded that list a week ago, talking about if it's not those 4, who else would it be? I think entering the discussion then would be Trinity, Connecticut, and NYU. And here, both of those are in this Randolph-Macon quadrant.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And again, I'm going to point back to the 2 things we already talked about. One, the Guilford pod at 2, to me feels a little strong. Also, stacking the 2 Region 10s next to each other where they are in the bottom of that Hampton-Sydney quadrant feels like we could have done a little bit more to move things around. And maybe the NCAA saw seeding a little differently than I did. It just feels like we stacked up, maybe 4 of the top 8 seeds in one quadrant over there. Again, just thinking of primary criteria, not even necessarily thinking of what's the actual team strength here, which is supposed to not be part of the process to a large degree.
Now let's talk about the Region 10 pods a little bit more. Now, one thing I do like that I see here with that Texas pod is that St. Thomas is the one that was sent out. So to me, keeping Trinity along with, in terms of overall team quality, now, they're there because they won the conference tournament, but Centenary, in terms of seeding, would be the lowest of the 3. So I like, instead of sending them out, I kind of like that they're kept in because that minimizes the chance that we would see another SCAC versus SCAC matchup in the second round.
Yeah, you would expect, right, just based on seeding Nebraska Wesleyan and Trinity to get through. So then we're avoiding that. I don't know if you want to play that game as a committee to say, like, we want to set up a team to lose maybe so another team gets through. We just saw Centenary
I'm not
go through a strong conference.
Results. Yeah. It's just if we're talking about protecting or trying to keep the ODACs away from each other, I think that, sending St. Thomas out to California is a way to maybe keep the SCACs away from each other a little bit.
Yeah, and I get that, and I could see that too. I would have done the opposite for seeding purposes. Again, I'm probably more hung up on seeding than I think the committee was or than you were. I think St. Thomas and Claremont makes for a more interesting bracket up there in California. I think that's a perfectly reasonable bracket. Again, with the knowledge that the 6, 11, 3, 14 has to get messed up a little bit because we're in Region 10 and we're flying teams in and out. Then it makes for kind of a bad bracket there down in Texas with Trinity, Texas versus Texas, Dallas, and then Centenary playing Nebraska Wesleyan. It just feels like that's not a great seeding matchup. But I get that we're kind of tied up a little bit. And I guess you're right. Then you're protecting your higher seeds a little bit better if you do it this way than if you had kept St. Thomas down with Trinity in the Texas pod and maybe moved Centenary up to play Cal Lutheran and had Whitworth play Claremont Mudd Scripps. Yeah, I think you're right that protects the top seeds a little better.
One other observation I would make with our hosts here is ultimately the American Rivers Conference does not have a host.
Yeah, and I'm not too surprised about that based on the outcome of the championship game. We saw Loras and Nebraska Wesleyan in overtime. I thought if Nebraska Wesleyan had won that game, they would have been set up really well, kind of criteria seeding wise to host. But then you and I, Zach, found out, I think that was Saturday morning, that maybe Nebraska Wesleyan hadn't even put into host to begin with. So that was kind of damaging to their hosting opportunities. I was wondering if maybe the committee would have thought Loras had moved up into sort of that top 16 zone to give them a pod. To me, I had them on the outside. I had them more like 20, not 16. So it wasn't surprising to me at the end to see, the ARC, the ARC, as it were, not getting a hosting position. And I think that makes sense, but that really jams up the geography and kind of the Midwest, because you have 4 teams make it. None of them are in position to host. Then it means you have to send one to Platteville, you have to send one to Trine, you have to send one to Wash U, and then the only other thing to do is to fly one out because you need another flight out to Region 4, and that's what the committee ended up doing there.
All right, I have a couple other American Rivers observations here, Matt. One involving Co. I think this is an interesting first round matchup for Co. They take on Wabash. Now, these two teams back in November were both at Illinois College. Now, they missed each other based on the first day's results, but they were at that same event. So it's just interesting to see them paired up here. I think that's just random and that's the way it worked out. But I saw that and I had to actually double check just to make sure that they had, in fact, missed each other, which I'm sure that I didn't miss something there because the committee would not put together a first round matchup that is a repeat of something we saw in the first round. But also, while it would take upsets, Matt, we have a potential Sweet 16 between Co and Dubuque, right? So another case where, probably the committee is not concerned with projecting multiple upsets. But just to see those two pods that contain 2 American Rivers Conference teams with Co and Dubuque possibly linked up in the Sweet 16.
Yeah, and they're probably not concerned. They're probably more concerned with quote unquote protecting the top seeds, like the host type teams,
right?
Which Guilford is, and the ARC teams are not. So that's probably one factor. The second factor is just the geography from, let's just call it Western Ohio on through Iowa or Minnesota. You just can't really do a whole lot within the 500-mile constraints, especially if you don't want to set up like 1.5 billion second weekend flights. So you kind of end up having to put them all in the same quadrant. So I think there's 2 reasons why they couldn't separate them there. But I think you're right. We could definitely, these teams are all good. Like if we saw 2 or 3 of those American Rivers teams get through their pods, we wouldn't be entirely surprised, I don't think.
Okay, any other final thoughts, Matt, before we move on? Of course, as I mentioned, we'll be having our first round opening weekend deep dive coming up later, but these were just some quick thoughts that we had as we were watching the show and some little notes that we made along the way.
Yeah, I think 2 other thoughts for me. I've been talking about seeding, and I know, again, the seeding isn't the same that they do in D1, but I think there's 2 places that are really kind of surprising to me of where we ended up. Looking at the teams on the 9, what I call the 9 line, so the teams in the same pods as the number 1s, but kind of in that neutral court matchup. So Farmingdale State, for example. I'm really surprised to see Farmingdale State where they are and then go 2 spaces lower to Carnegie Mellon. Like, to me, just flip those 2 teams. And I think that makes a better seeding. Carnegie Mellon was an at-large team. Farmingdale State was never going to get in as an at-large team. So why are they kind of seeded as if Farmingdale State was ahead of Carnegie Mellon? Now, it could be because La Roche is Region 7 and we don't want to put another Region 7 team in the same pod. If that's the reason, I don't like that reason. I would say just flip those teams. It makes it for a way better bracket according to how we should be seeding things based on the primary criteria. I think maybe similar when I'm looking at the Case Western Reserve pod with Hope and Anderson. I think Hope makes a lot of sense there. Anderson, I start to question Now, I know we get into geographical issues again in that kind of Indiana, Illinois, Ohio range in where we can send teams. But then you scoot over to the John Carroll pod and you see like Calvin and Elmhurst. If Case is a higher seed and John Carroll is a lower seed, then that means we're seeding Calvin higher than Hope still, which we've seen all along in the regional rankings. And I would agree that that makes sense. So why are we sending a lower seed Anderson where we could be sending Elmhurst? By the regional rankings, it makes sense to flip those teams and have Anderson play Calvin at John Carroll and have Elmhurst play Hope at Case Western Reserve. So again, that 9, and then looking one more spot over Geneva, I think all the way up at a 9, what I'm calling a 9 seed. The NCAA Division III doesn't call it a 9 seed. I think that's a little high. Like just switch them with Swarthmore down there at 11. Like Swarthmore won the AQ, but if they had not won the AQ, they maybe would have been on the fringes of that Pool C discussion. I don't think Geneva would have been anywhere close to that Pool C discussion. So why are we seeding them that way? It seems like we didn't really seed some. Maybe we just bucketed teams to kind of very generally, kind of like you're a pod number 1, you're a pod number 2, you're a pod number 3, you're a pod number 4. I think that's useful for some discussions, but when we're doing this, I think there's a lot of places we can make a better bracket. In those 1 seed pods, I think we're supposed to see like an 8-9 kind of a matchup, 2 teams that are pretty even, and I think we see kind of some seeding mismatches here, which I'm surprised to see in those areas. So I think seeding in general is something that it's not terrible all over the bracket here, but I think we could have done a lot better job with just a few swaps.
And with some of the restrictions in place in Division III, it's not always possible, but what you mentioned, it seems like it certainly could have been done.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then the one I didn't highlight for the 9 seed was Hobart. I think Hobart's kind of reasonable there, but then if you're taking Williams in the pod right below, again, I would just flip those 2 teams. I would flip Williams and Hobart, and I think that's, to me, a better, more balanced seeded bracket than what we have here. So I think all what I'm calling 9s, I think they're all a little bit wrong compared to basically who's the quote unquote 11 or 12 in those same quadrants. I think we could have flipped a bunch of those, made it better for seeding. Yes, it might have put like 2 Region 3 teams in the same pod, but like, I don't care. Why would we care about that? I think we can get too cute about mixing up our quote unquote regions, which are super arbitrary lines. Like we see, what's the difference between Region 1 and 2 geographically? It's like nothing. What's the difference between Region 4 and Region 5 geographically? It's like nothing. We see a team like Morrisville State, who's going from like Region 4 to Region 1 to Region whatever in 3 consecutive years because they're changing conferences. Let's not get too married to the number that are next to the regions. Let's build a better bracket. I think we could seed a little bit better here.
Sounds good. All right, Matt, now that we know who is in, who is out, we can get to the most important bit of reaction and post-analysis, and that's to check back in on our way too early Pool C fantasy draft. Matt, we did this way back in early December, and I'm not so pleased to report that you took my crown. I won this contest last year. You won it this year. We tried to do a draft to pick the 22 Pool Cs way back in early December. 3 points for a correct Pool C pick. 1 point if our pick ended up being a Pool A. Ultimately, Matt, we did pretty similarly with just the difference between us. I had way too many Pool A's. Okay, we both had a miss there very early on. We both had a miss with our last pick. But ultimately, I think the conference tournament upsets were more in your favor in this contest than they were mine.
Yeah, I think we both ended up with the same strategies this year, which is pick strong resumes and don't worry about if they should be Pool A picks or not, because you're going to get some upsets. And I think for the second year in a row, the biggest slam dunk, they're a bad pick because there's no way they're going to get upset in their conference tournament. I feel like that hit for the second year in a row. Last year, it was St. Joseph, Connecticut, in the GNAC. They went undefeated in the GNAC and then lost. The whole season, I think they were undefeated. But then they lost to Albertus Magnus in the championship game. Right. This year, so neither of us picked them last year. This year, I think that team was maybe Oswego State in the SUNYAC. And I don't think either of us picked Oswego State, even though they had a strong resume. We knew they were going to get a Pool C bid. But we didn't really think that they were going to lose. And so that bit us again. They did fall to SUNY New Paltz, and Oswego State would have been a great pick here. But I think overall we picked good teams that were definitely putting up strong resumes that maybe were going to win their Pool A. And that bit you, Zach. I think it bit me a little bit last year. But ultimately, we got a bunch of tournament teams correct.
All right.
If I recall, can I just say one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
If I recall, one of the comments on the post of this draft was from our friend Ryan Scott. Love you, Ryan Scott. But the comment was, who's going to beat Widener? Right? The answer is Eastern. Eastern's going to beat Widener.
All right, Matt, we have a quick mailbag to pick up here. This comes from Tyler. After the Pool C bids are accounted for and the field is set, who do you think just missed the bubble thanks to conference tourney bid thieves?
Yeah, we didn't really, on the previous slides, we didn't really talk about the Pool C picture or who was in or who was out. But we did do our Hoopsville projections. That was part of the panel on Sunday night. And we ended up missing one again. I think we got 21 out of 22 correct. And I think here's kind of what the board looked like. So on Hoopsville, the team that I was a part of picked Carnegie Mellon. We picked St. Thomas, Texas. We picked Dubuque. And then we picked Illinois Wesleyan, but we saw the committee here pick Stockton. So we think these are maybe the last four in. We don't know exactly if these were the conversations. Maybe Carnegie Mellon or St. Thomas had gotten in a pick or two higher than this, and maybe Williams or I don't know who else was maybe in the mix was further down. But then the teams we were considering on the Hoopsville panel was like Illinois Wesleyan, Nichols, Connecticut College, and Mount Union. So these were the other teams that were in the mix. So just looking at the resume, Stockton had gotten in with the 630 winning percentage. I think that's the lowest number I can remember. We were all, anyway, a 630 winning percentage, 574 strength of schedule, 5-6 versus regionally ranked opponents. They had a good win, great win against Keene State, two really good wins against Rowan, who are maybe fringe just outside the top 16 picture type of team. And then they had a couple other was TCNJ and so on. We were all up in arms, the community was all up in arms about Rochester getting in last year. They were 640, like 624 strength of schedule and 10 wins versus regionally ranked. I think the debate this season was the Carnegie Mellon, 640, 601, 6-6 with 4 wins against regional number 1, top 16 team. So from this picture, Carnegie Mellon was like way safe if Stockton was going to get in because they were like the Stockton resume juiced up to another degree. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we had thought that Illinois Wesleyan was going to get in with like the 704 winning percentage, 546 strength of schedule. They are giving something up on the strength of schedule there, but they still have a really good win kind of in range with that Keene State win. Wash U, we saw Wash U kind of look like on the 2 line, but maybe given geography and stuff, they were pretty similar to Keene State. So we thought that was kind of the top wins were maybe similar enough that we would go with a higher winning percentage team that still had a very strong strength of schedule. But we also talked about it being very close between some of these teams. Nichols, Conn College, Mount Union all had strong numbers as well.
Yeah, Matt, we talked about the seeding too. So maybe that is another indication that Carnegie Mellon was further up, maybe not a last 4 in.
Yeah, but they were like the way they're seeded looked like they were super low down the list, even though they were not necessarily last 4 in or only borderline so.
Right, or compared to a Williams, maybe Williams was further down the list.
Yeah,
who knows?
Maybe, yeah. Maybe they flopped with Williams and they were a spot higher.
All right, so I mentioned we've got a lot of shows coming out here over the next couple of days. We'll pick up any mailbag items we have along the way. If you have something that you'd like for us to address in the mailbag here on our Tuesday show or Wednesday show, you can send it in via social media. You can find us at D3 Datacast on X/Twitter, on Facebook. You can leave a comment on this here YouTube episode or future episodes, and we'll pick it up. Lots of ways to get in touch with us. We'd love to address whatever our viewers would like for us to discuss. And as we've mentioned, those other episodes will be available in early access through Patreon as soon as they're ready. So while they'll post Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, as soon as we have them ready, they'll get sent out in early access on Patreon, patreon.com/D3Datacast for more information there on how you can access the early access period for those videos to come and support us at an even deeper level.
3 big weeks left, Zach, of Division III basketball. Boom, boom, boom. Big matchups every single Friday and Saturday. This is going to be great. We'll bring kind of our preview and prediction shows coming on, but this was fun reacting to the bracket. Glad we got to see where teams are going. Super excited about it. So Zach, I think that's probably it for today. We're going to sign off. Great job, team.
Good job, team.